What's up, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Ste Reacts. Today, we're going to be looking at some of the clips from Heart and Soil's new documentary, Fed a Lie, which features experts such as Nina Teicholz, Dr. Paul Saladino, and Dr. Chris Kenobi. Let's see what they have to say about seed oils.
When you eat these oils, these oxidized oils, they enter into your body, they're absorbed into your blood, they actually pass through the blood-brain barrier.
By the way, if you don't know why we have a blood-brain barrier, it is to stop things from getting inside and interacting with the brain that shouldn't be there. So anything that passes through the blood-brain barrier is not a good thing, generally, if it's not supposed to pass through. There are certain compounds, etc., that the body is supposed to let through. But things like seed oils, oxidized fats getting through there and causing brain inflammation, and things like microplastics getting through the blood-brain barrier, no bueno. So that's not a good thing.
And they drive inflammation in your body. Cottonseed oil had originally been used as a lubricant for machinery in the Industrial Revolution. After we had hunted all the whales out of the ocean, we hunted the whales mainly for their fat. When we lost that source of fat, it had to be replaced.
It's so funny, well, it's tragically funny, I guess, that the reason we transitioned into using engine lubricant as an oil was because we hunted the whales and took all of their fat, so we put it back in. Now we're becoming the whales and getting fat because we're eating seed oils up the wazoo.
Cottonseed oil came in to fill that need for all kinds of machinery, for making candles and soaps, and that was it. Then Procter & Gamble came along and said, let's try to sell this as a foodstuff. So in 1911, they sold it as an ersatz, a fake lard, and they called it Crisco. Crisco was the first time anywhere in the history of the world that vegetable oils were marketed as a food item to be consumed by humans.
Butter and lard and even tallow began to be replaced and supplanted. And this is what took off in the 20th century.
In the 1920s, 30s, 40s, the American Heart Association was a sleepy little organization because cardiologists were relatively rare, as heart disease was relatively rare back then. And then in 1948, in comes Procter & Gamble.
And they literally infused $1.7 million into the American Heart Association, which was this little tiny organization. $1.7 million is the equivalent of $20 million today. So,
damn. Can anybody say conflicts of interest much?
So the American Heart Association became a huge organization overnight.
Before Procter & Gamble stepped in, it's really clear that the American Heart Association is struggling as an organization that doesn't have much power or many funds. So this is a chapter, starts from 1946. There is little doubt that the cardiologists, the scientists, and local groups involved with the American Heart Association were extremely frustrated. Their inability to deal with disease, but also their inability to get anybody's attention. The president of the AHA was presented a check by representatives of Procter & Gamble. Suddenly, the coffers were filled. American housewives had shifted over to seed oils because they were cheaper. Margarine was cheaper than butter. Seed oils were cheaper than any kind of animal fat for cooking. There was an economic incentive, but now there was a medical incentive.
I mean, you got to give it to them. It's a little bit evil genius-y, right? They create the sickness and then sell the cure. They've got all of this leftover stuff, and they're going to convince the entire world that, hey, maybe we should eat this. And maybe we should even convince you that eating this is better than eating the foods you've been evolutionarily designed to eat. Whoa.
In 1955, President Eisenhower had a heart attack. The attention of the nation was 100% focused on President Eisenhower and what caused heart disease. Nobody knew. The public was desperate for answers. Here was the #1 killer of the nation, felling men in the prime of life, and really, people had no idea about how to protect themselves. So into this vacuum steps Ancel Keys. Ancel Keys believed that saturated fat and cholesterol caused heart disease because they would raise your blood cholesterol, and like hot oil down a cold stovepipe would gradually shrink your arteries until you had a heart attack. That was called the diet heart hypothesis. Ancel Keys got onto the Nutrition Committee of the American Heart Association in 1960, and in 1961, 1 year later, even though there was no additional new science, the American Heart Association endorsed his view. and adopted Ansel Keys's hypothesis.
From the beginning of the production, sale, distribution of vegetable oils, it was never about health. It was always about profit.
That unfortunately seems to be the sad story of our health landscape right now, that it's not about health, it's about profits. We use this term healthcare, and I'll air quote that because it seems to be more like sick care. And it's crazy that this fever all kicked off around the 1950s, where if you go back 50 years before that, the very early 1900s, heart attacks are so rare that they're not on the tip of anybody's tongue. Nobody's thinking about that. Just 50 years later, you've got this #1 killer out of nowhere. What was the single biggest change that happened in our food? Seed oils.
Seed oils are absolutely not natural. They're not a food of nature. Seed oils are the single most processed food on the planet.
That's kind of a crazy statement, but when you think about it and you understand what the process is, seed oils are the single most processed food on the planet. That's how much adultering they have to go through to make it to something that is remotely edible to be on your shelves. And maybe not edible at all, because it was designed as an engine lubricant. And nobody should be eating engine lubricant, even if you think you're a machine.
Seeds, nuts, beans can only be made into an oil in a factory. It needs to go through so many industrial steps in order to create the oil.
The actual process of making these oils heats them to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. And then they must be deodorized at the end of that, because the process of heating the oils to 500 degrees inevitably causes them to become rancid, oxidized, or rusted in the colloquial sense.
So no one would eat seed oils. They would run from them if they smelled them before the deodorization process.
By the way, you might notice this smell. If you have a keen nose and you're in some kind of strip mall or something that's got a restaurant that's using deep fat fryers, you can smell the rancidity that they're talking about. It's a very distinct smell. It's oxidized oil that's probably been in those fryers for days, if not weeks, that has been heated over and over and over again. And it starts to have this nasty, funky smell. And this is what happens in the chemical manufacturing of it. They heat it up, it smells gross because it's breaking down, it's literally becoming toxic. Then they deodorize it, and then they treat it with all of these other solvents and bleach it, and then put it back in a bottle and try to sell it to you as some kind of miracle heart-healthy food. It's absolutely bonkers.
From the beginning of the production, sale, distribution of vegetable oils, it was never about health. They promoted vegetable oils as healthy, but it was never about health. It was always about profit. There were so many things that all came together at the right times to create an atmosphere of belief in this hypothesis that animal fats and saturated animal fat were the enemy.
I love how these graphs just tell such a powerful picture. You can see the saturated fats stay pretty stable, and what you see is vegetable oils exploding from the early 1900s, really taking off around 1960, and in tandem, what rises beautifully with that is heart disease deaths.
Seed oils do lower your cholesterol and your total and your LDL cholesterol. In large clinical trials, the most rigorous kind of evidence on 76,000 people, lowering your LDL cholesterol by consuming seed oils has never been shown to have any benefit for death from heart disease or death from any cause.
What we have in Western medicine is this propensity to look at all of the data together without looking at carefully how good every individual study is. When there are multiple studies on a topic and the results of those studies are conflicting, what we tend to do in Western medicine is zoom out, when we should be zooming in to look at the quality of every individual study.
Just to give you a sense of how early warning signs on seed oils were ignored, in 1956, there was a trial on corn oil by somebody named G.A. Rose. They fed 19 teaspoons of corn oil to subjects, and they followed them for 3 years compared to a control group. At the end of 2 years, they stopped the experiment early because people having corn oil were dying at such higher rates. At the end of the experiment, the researchers wrote, "We have to recognize that clinical trials are not always to the benefit of the patients, and we cannot recommend vegetable oils to fight heart disease, and they are possibly harmful." There should have been no experiments since then. It should have been game over for seed oils. In the early 1980s, when clinical trials, again, high-level evidence, began to show that feeding people seed oils caused cancer, especially colon cancer. This was in a dozen clinical trials this result came out. The National Institutes of Health had a series of very high-level meetings, including the top scientists of the day, trying to explain why were people dying from cancer from seed oil diets. I mean, they had a number of explanations, but nobody was satisfied by them. And ultimately they decided, well, reducing cholesterol was just so important that they would just ignore the cancer results. And then there were other results in conferences that came out, animal experiments showing cirrhosis of the liver from seed oils. There were results about toxic oxidation products. What concerns me most is that this science is not unknown. It has just been silenced.
That's so crazy that they had the power, these powerful oligarchs of big seed oil, to come together and bury any evidence that was inconvenient to the narrative of getting these in every supermarket and in every home in the United States and thus the world, that anything that showed detrimental effects was just buried. And the blessing now is that we can dig these things up and resurface them and have these kinds of conversations. But you've seen this ploy before. You have seen the scientists. You have seen the mecca of these three-letter agencies and institutions completely corrupt the narrative, curate bad science, and hide inconvenient facts that don't suit the narrative. They've done it before. They will do it again. You have to use your discernment to read between the lines. And at this point, I just don't even think we need any more science to acknowledge the huge, obese elephant in the room. We are sicker than we've ever been before. We're eating more seed oils than we ever have. These do not belong in your diet, and you should get them out immediately. If you like those clips, please check out the full movie, Fed a Lie. It's on the Heart and Soil YouTube channel now. Like it, subscribe it. Let's make this viral. Let's make health and wellness as infectious as disease. Send this to your aunties, send this to your uncles, send it to your mom and dad. Let's take down big seed oils together and let's spread this message of radical health. Me and you, we're gonna do it. Let's go.